Buckle up, folks, because today we're diving headfirst into one of the most fascinating periods in Argentine history.
We're talking Perón, right?
Yeah, Perón. And you know what makes this deep dive extra juicy?
Let me guess, some amazing primary sources.
You got it. We've got excerpts from Perón's first and second five-year plans. We've got a biography of Néstor Kirchner.
Wow.
I know, right? And to top it all off, we've even got transcripts of some pretty fiery congressional debates from Perón's first term as president.
Talk about a front row seat to history.
Right. It's like we're right there in the room as Argentina is being reshaped. But here's the big question we're wrestling with today. Was Peronism a force for good or a recipe for disaster?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Perón's legacy is so complex.
Totally. And to help us untangle all of this, we've got an expert on all things 20th century Latin America.
Well, I wouldn't say all things, but I do know a thing or two about Perón and his impact on Argentina.
Perfect. Okay, so before we go any further, set the stage for us. Argentina before Perón, what was the situation like?
Okay, imagine Argentina in the 1940s. It's the middle of World War II, and the world is in chaos. Argentina stayed neutral, but the war really messed with their trade.
I can see how that would cause some problems.
Big problems. They suddenly couldn't import a lot of the goods they relied on, so they had to start making their own stuff.
So the war kind of forced them to industrialize.
Exactly, and that industrialization had some major social and political consequences. You had this rapid growth of factories and a surge in the urban working class.
More workers, more power, right?
Right. And that led to the rise of a powerful labor movement. These workers wanted better wages, better working conditions, and a bigger say in how the country was run.
So Argentina was basically ripe for a leader who could tap into that working class energy.
Exactly. And then along comes Juan Perón. He was a charismatic military officer who saw an opportunity.
He saw that the workers needed a champion.
That's one way to put it. Perón promised them better wages, more benefits, and a real voice in the government. He appealed to their sense of national pride and their desire for a more just society.
So that's where that whole Peronism thing comes from.
Yeah, Peronism is kind of a tricky thing to define. It's a blend of nationalism, social justice, and this idea of empowering the everyday person. Some people call it economic populism.
I've definitely heard that term before, but whatever you call it, it worked. Perón won the 1946 election by a landslide.
No doubt about it. He had a huge following, especially among the working class.
Okay, so now we've got Perón in power. And lucky for us, we've got these excerpts from his first five-year plan. I gotta admit, I was a little intimidated just flipping through it.
It's definitely an ambitious document. Perón wasn't messing around.
It's clear he wanted to make some big changes.
He didn't just want economic growth.
Yeah.
He wanted to completely reshape Argentine society. And he saw this five-year plan as the way to do it.
Okay, so before we get lost in all the details, what were some of the key things that jumped out at you when you first read through the plan?
Well, one of the biggest things was nationalization. Perón believed that key industries, like railroads and energy, should be run by the state, not for profit, but for the good of the people.
So he wanted to take those industries out of the hands of private companies and put them under government control.
Exactly. This was a major shift from the more hands-off approach of previous governments, and it was a key part of Perón's vision for a more just and equitable society.
It sounds kind of radical, especially for the 1940s. So was everyone on board with this whole nationalization thing? Or was there pushback?
Oh, there was definitely pushback. Not everyone was thrilled about the government taking over private businesses. Those who own these companies obviously weren't happy.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then there were also some practical concerns about how to actually manage these newly state-run industries effectively.
So it wasn't just a matter of flipping a switch and saying, now it's the people's railroad. There were some real challenges to work out.
Right. And beyond the economics, there were also huge philosophical questions about the role of government. Perón's opponents argued that he was being way too controlling, that he was stifling individual freedom and the free market.
But I bet Perón's supporters, mainly the working class, saw him as a hero, right?
Oh, absolutely. They believed a strong government was needed to protect workers and make sure everyone benefited from economic growth, not just the wealthy elite.
So there was a real ideological battle going on here, and those congressional debates you sent over, they really capture the intensity of those arguments.
They really do. It's fascinating to read through those transcripts and see how passionately people argued for and against Perón's ideas.
Okay, so we've talked about nationalization, but what about some of the other big pieces of Perón's first five-year plan? What else was he trying to achieve?
Well, alongside nationalization, Perón was also a huge proponent of social welfare programs. He knew that economic progress didn't mean much if people were still struggling to make ends meet.
He wanted to make sure that the benefits of economic growth were shared by everyone, not just the wealthy few.
Exactly. He pushed for things like universal health care, wider access to education, massive housing projects. He really wanted to create a more equal society.
Sounds kind of like a politician promising the world, right? But did Perón actually deliver on any of this?
That's where things get really interesting. There's no doubt that Perón's policies had a huge impact on Argentina, for better and for worse. His social programs definitely improved lives for many people. His focus on industry and infrastructure laid the foundation for later economic growth.
So some real positives there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it wasn't all sunshine and roses. Some of his solutions created new problems down the road. We'll definitely need to unpack those as we go deeper into his plans and their consequences.
I'm sensing some unintended consequences lurking around the corner. But before we get to all that, you mentioned earlier that Perón wanted to completely reshape Argentine society. Was it just about economics, or did he have his sights set on other aspects of Argentine life as well?
Oh, he definitely had a broader vision. And that's where the second five-year plan gets really interesting. Perón was obsessed with promoting a distinct Argentine identity.
He wanted to create a sense of national unity and pride.
Exactly. He wanted to promote Argentine culture, reduce foreign influence, and even regulate the language.
Hold up, regulate the language? What does that even mean? Was he like a grammar police, telling people how to speak?
It wasn't quite that extreme, but he did want to shape the Argentine language to reflect national pride.
Interesting. So was that focus on language and culture something new in the second five-year plan? Why wasn't it a big deal in the first one?
That's a great question. It could be that he learned from the challenges of the first plan and realized that cultural identity was just as important as economic and social changes.
Maybe he realized he needed to win hearts and minds as well as wallets.
Or maybe he just felt more confident after his initial success and was ready to tackle these bigger, more symbolic issues. Either way, the second five-year plan is a whole other beast.
I am hooked. But before we get lost in the weeds of the second plan, let's pause for a second here. I want you, dear listener, to think about this. What's your impression of Perón so far? Hero, villain, visionary, control freak? Keep those thoughts in mind as we head into part 2 of this deep dive, because next time, things are going to get really juicy. All right, we're back and ready to tackle Perón's second five-year plan. I'm already getting the sense that this one's going to be even more intense than the first.
It definitely kicks things up a notch.
Yeah.
But remember, it's not just about what Perón wanted to do, it's about how those plans actually played out in the real world.
Okay, spill the tea. What kind of drama are we talking about?
Well, the first plan focused on the big, sweeping changes, right?
Yeah.
Nationalization, social programs, the whole shebang. But the second plan dives into the nitty-gritty details of how to actually make those changes work. And that's where those congressional debates you sent over become so valuable. They give us a glimpse into the arguments and the compromises that were happening behind the scenes.
So it's like we're getting a sneak peek behind the curtain of Perón's grand performance. What were some of the big issues they were grappling with?
You got to remember, Perón's pushing for a radical shift in how Argentina operates. He wants to empower the working class, challenge the old elite, and reshape the economy in a way that benefits the masses. And there were some pretty powerful forces pushing back against him every step of the way.
Makes sense. You can't just upend the entire system without ruffling some feathers.
Exactly. And those transcripts show just how fierce these debates were. You had conservatives arguing that Perón was turning Argentina into a socialist state, that he was ruining the economy by scaring off foreign investors. And on the other side, you had passionate Peronists defending his every move, arguing that he was the only one who truly cared about the working class and the future of Argentina.
Man, I can practically hear the shouting matches happening in those congressional chambers. But how did Perón manage to push through his agenda with all that opposition?
He was a master politician. The transcripts show a guy who knew how to build alliances, make strategic concessions, and play the game to get what he wanted. He understood the power of symbolism, of appealing directly to the people, and he used that to his advantage.
So it wasn't just about good ideas, it was about knowing how to sell those ideas and outmaneuver his opponents.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But even with his political savvy, Perón wasn't always successful. Take nationalization, for example. While it was popular initially, bringing those key industries under state control didn't always work out so well.
Really? I thought that was a cornerstone of his whole economic plan. What went wrong?
Well, the idea was to run these industries for the benefit of the people, right? But state-run companies often lack the efficiency and innovation of private businesses.
Hmm.
Plus, there were accusations of corruption and mismanagement. It turns out running a country isn't as easy as it looks.
Okay, so that's one point for the Peronism is a recipe for disaster camp. But what about all those social programs? Those seem pretty popular, right?
They were. And to be fair, Perón's social welfare programs did a lot of good. Expanding healthcare, education, providing a safety net for the most vulnerable, that was a huge legacy.
So what's the catch? There's always a catch, right?
The catch is that these programs cost money, a
Mm.
lot of money. And Perón's government wasn't always the best at managing its finances. Plus, some critics argued that these programs created a culture of dependency, discouraging people from working and relying on government handouts instead.
Hmm. So even the seemingly positive aspects of Peronism had their downsides. It's like this guy was constantly walking a tightrope between ambition and unintended consequences.
That's a perfect way to put it. And speaking of tightropes, let's not forget about that whole regulating language thing in the second five-year plan. That's where things get really interesting, especially if we want to understand Perón's lasting impact on Argentina today.
You're right. This is the part I'm most curious about. I mean, it's one thing to build factories and hand out benefits, but messing with people's language, that feels way more invasive, even Orwellian. What was he even trying to achieve with that?
It all goes back to that idea of creating a distinct Argentine identity. Perón believed that language was a powerful tool for shaping how people think and feel about their country. He wanted to create a uniquely Argentine Spanish, free from the influence of Spain or other European powers.
But wasn't Argentine Spanish already pretty distinct? They have their own slang, their own accents, their own way of speaking. Why go through all the trouble of formally regulating it?
Because for Perón, it was about more than just words. It was about national pride, about cultural independence, about forging a new national identity for Argentina. He saw language as the key to uniting the country and breaking free from its colonial past.
So it was like a symbolic act, a way of saying, we're not just a copy of Europe anymore, we're our own thing.
Exactly. And the dictionaries played into this. Perón believed that by controlling the official definition of words, he could influence how people use language and ultimately how they saw themselves as Argentines. It's a pretty fascinating idea, even if it sounds a bit crazy.
Okay, hold on a second. You're saying that the way Argentines speak today, their very sense of identity, could be influenced by a dictionary that Perón commissioned almost a century ago? That's blowing my mind.
It's certainly a possibility. Of course, language is a living thing. It's constantly evolving. But there's no doubt that Perón's efforts to shape Argentine Spanish left their mark.
This is where I start to wonder, is Perón a visionary or a control freak? Maybe he's a little bit of both.
That's the beauty of studying history. It's rarely black and white.
Yeah.
But before we pass judgment on Perón, let's jump ahead a few decades. You sent over a biography of Néstor Kirchner, who was president of Argentina from 2003 to 2007.
Right. And he was a huge Peronist, wasn't he?
He was. And Kirchner's story gives us a fascinating perspective on Perón's legacy. Here's a guy who came to power decades after Perón in a completely different world facing new challenges.
Yeah.
Yet he saw in Perón's ideas a roadmap for tackling the problems of his own time.
So what can Kirchner teach us about the lasting power of Peronism? What echoes of Perón do we see in Kirchner's presidency?
Well, think about Argentina in the early 2000s. The country was still reeling from a devastating economic crisis. People were disillusioned with traditional politicians. They were hungry for change. And Kirchner tapped into that same populist energy that propelled Perón to power decades earlier.
So he was basically Perón 2.0. Same ideas, different century.
Not quite. While Kirchner certainly drew inspiration from Perón, he also updated the Peronist playbook for the 21st century. He was much more focused on human rights, for example, something Perón had a bit of a blind spot on.
That makes sense. Argentina went through a brutal dictatorship in the 70s and 80s. Those wounds were still pretty fresh when Kirchner came to power.
Exactly. And while Perón was a product of his time with all the complexities that entails, Kirchner was dealing with a different set of challenges and had to adapt accordingly. But the core principles of Peronism, social justice, economic independence, a strong role for the state, were still there in Kirchner's policies.
So it sounds like Peronism is more than just a set of policies or a historical period. It's like this evolving ideology that shapes how Argentines think about politics and their place in the world.
That's a really insightful observation. And it's one of the key things I hope our listener takes away from this deep dive. Peronism isn't just some dusty history lesson. It's a living force that continues to shape Argentina's political landscape, for better or worse.
All right, dear listener. It's time to put on your thinking cap again. Knowing what we know now about Perón, his policies, his impact, and the way later leaders like Kirchner drew on his legacy, what's your verdict? Is Peronism ultimately a force for good or a recipe for disaster in Argentina? Keep these thoughts in mind as we wrap up this deep dive and explore what Perón's legacy means for Argentina today. So we've really dug into the heart of Peronist Argentina, exploring the man, his ambitious plans, and the impact those ideas had. But let's fast forward to today.
Yeah, where does Perón fit in with modern-day Argentina?
Exactly. Like, does his legacy still hold any weight, or is it ancient history?
Oh, trust me, Perón's shadow looms large, even today. You can't talk about Argentine politics without bumping into his ghost.
Really? But how? I mean, Argentina today is a world away from the 1940s.
Think about it. Perón's ideas, his emphasis on social justice, his focus on the working class, those things are baked into the DNA of Argentina.
But didn't we also talk about how some of those policies, while well-intentioned, maybe had some not-so-great consequences down the line?
Right, like those social programs we talked about earlier.
Right.
Some critics argued they created a culture of dependency, made the government's finances a bit shaky.
So those problems didn't just magically disappear.
Not quite. The debates we see today about universal health care, affordable housing, the power of unions, those are all echoes of Perón's legacy.
So it's like Argentina's still trying to figure out how to balance the good and the bad of Peronism.
Exactly. And here's the thing, the world itself has changed drastically since Perón's era. Globalization, for instance, was something he wasn't a big fan of, but modern-day Peronists see engaging with the global market as crucial for growth.
It's like Peronism itself had to adapt to survive.
Right. Another interesting twist is the role of women in Peronist politics. Back in Perón's day, women weren't major players in his movement, even though his wife, Evita, was super popular.
She was like the face of Peronism for a lot of people, wasn't she?
Exactly, but nowadays you see women at the forefront of Peronist politics. Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, Néstor Kirchner's widow, she even served 2 terms as president.
Hold on, wasn't she a pretty divisive figure too? Didn't her critics say she was a little too Peronist in her approach?
Yeah, she was definitely a strong personality. She wasn't afraid to use state power. She renationalized industries, expanded those social programs we talked about, and took a hard line on certain issues.
It sounds like she took a page right out of Perón's playbook.
She definitely did. And that approach won her a lot of passionate supporters who loved her strong stance.
But there must have been people who weren't so thrilled.
Oh, yeah, she had her fair share of critics who felt she was too controlling, that her policies were hurting the economy.
So it seems like these core elements of Peronism, the economic populism, the state intervention, the focus on social justice, they can be a double-edged sword.
That's a great way to put it. And that's precisely why Peronism is still such a hot topic in Argentina today. It stirs up strong emotions because it forces people to confront these fundamental questions about the role of government and the balance between individual freedom and the collective good.
So after all this, where do you stand on the question we started with? Was Peronism ultimately good or bad for Argentina?
Honestly, there's no simple answer. It's a complicated legacy, full of contradictions. It's like a tangled web of positive and negative outcomes that are still unraveling today.
It sounds like Perón's ghost is still very much alive and kicking in Argentine politics.
In a way, yes. But it's more than just a ghost. It's a set of ideas, way of thinking about society and politics that continues to resonate with many Argentines, even if they don't always agree on how those ideas should be applied in the 21st century.
Well, this deep dive has definitely opened my eyes to the complexities of Argentina, its history, and the enduring legacy of Juan Perón. It's clear that this story is far from over.
Not by a long shot. And I encourage you, dear listener, to keep exploring this story, dig deeper into those sources, seek out different perspectives, and form your own opinion about Perón and his impact on Argentina.
It's a journey worth taking, and hey, who knows, maybe you'll even come to appreciate the power of dictionaries along the way.
No, that would be a truly Peronist twist, wouldn't it?
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the heart of Peronist Argentina. Until next time, keep those minds curious and keep exploring the world around you.